After 4 years together, he ended our relationship, saying he was tired. I waited for him for 5 hours, only to realize I wasn't worth it. I am a 21-year-old female, and my former partner is a 23-year-old male. We recently ended our nearly 4-year relationship. Interestingly, he was the one who decided to break up with me. Prior to our breakup, we had cohabited for about 4 months in an apartment near my mother's house. He proposed that we rent at their place. However, since my school and workplace were quite far from there, I suggested it would be more practical to find a rental closer to my school, which would also minimize my commute. He could manage, even without a stable job. He also stopped studying because he claimed he might become lazy midway. Initially, everything was going smoothly. We split expenses evenly. For me, the issues began when I frequently tried to borrow his phone. At first, he lent it to me without hesitation. However, as time passed, his responses became increasingly reluctant, with him often making excuses or taking longer to give it to me. I initially brushed it off, thinking it was just due to his personal matters or friends. But after several months, I noticed he was becoming less willing to share his phone. He mentioned earning money from games by converting in-game items to cash, so I assumed that was the reason behind his behavior. When we moved to a new place, I also started medication for my PCOS, as I was struggling with sleep due to my workload as a student. Sometimes, I would unintentionally direct my stress onto him at home, especially after tiring days at work. I usually kept quiet after returning from work to decompress and not unload my frustrations onto him since he wasn't contributing. I frequently questioned his feelings for me not because I doubted them, but because I wanted reassurance. Early in December, he suggested we return to our respective families for a bit. When I asked why, he explained that he couldn't contribute to the rent or bills as he had no current side jobs. I assured him that I could cover the bills for now, telling him he could pay me back when he was able. Initially, he agreed. However, when I requested to borrow his phone again, he replied, "Don't you have a phone?" This response came after he had been evasive since the end of November. I covered all the bills to prevent any financial strain on him, deciding to use our deposit for our rent, and suggesting we return to our families temporarily. I initially mentioned returning in January, but my actual plan was to continue the rent without his knowledge. Knowing me so well, he anticipated my intentions. When he visited his family during the last week of December and said goodbye, I understood he needed a break. I allowed him to be with his family for New Year's since his mother hadn't let him come home for Christmas, and I was alone at my place. However, after he returned from his family, I sensed a shift in him. He started insisting that I inform our caretaker we were moving out at the end of January. My plan was to extend our stay and let him decide where he wanted to go, so I didn't tell the caretaker about his intentions. I had explicitly told him I did not mind staying alone if he preferred to go home, but he insisted that he couldn't focus on work with me being alone and worried about me. One day, I returned home from work and reminded him that we were supposed to buy food together to save money. He agreed, but when I arrived home, he was still sleeping and asked for 5 more minutes. Eventually, I urged him to wake up so I could prepare dinner as I had school later. He became annoyed and suggested I send the food ingredients through his phone so he could buy them for me. I requested his phone, and as he was about to type, I was astonished by his sudden reaction. I was shocked when he told me he wouldn't let me use his phone. It was a stark change in behavior that had never happened before. Frustrated, I went to bed without dinner. When I woke, I saw him lying at the edge of the bed, had enough of the situation, and returned to my mother's home. After returning to our apartment, I found him eating. I confronted him about his reluctance to share his phone, and he responded angrily, mentioning he would break it if I kept asking. I snapped and told him he had previously deceived me by chatting and calling other people when we had problems. He claimed we were going in circles, and it was exhausting. I expressed that I had made changes, and he seemed indifferent. In the heat of the moment, I physically hurt him, hitting and kicking him. Once I realized the gravity of my actions, I apologized, even kneeling to seek his forgiveness because I lost control. He remarked that I had changed, saying I wasn't violent in the past during arguments. I told him I wanted him to leave because I could not live with a dishonest person. He then questioned if I thought he couldn't manage without me. Every time we were calm, I repeatedly asked if he loved me, and although he would initially say yes, he eventually withdrew and became angry. He returned home after I dropped him off, claiming he had something to handle. He came home the next night, and I was hopeful to reconcile. I accepted blame for hurting him and even bought beef for dinner. However, as soon as I cooked, he brought up the topic of moving, which I was trying to avoid to prevent conflict. He criticized me for not telling the caretaker, questioned why I refused to return home to his family, and accused me of having an inflated self-image. Feeling hurt by his words, I agreed to inform our caretaker. At first, he said we wouldn't break up, just take a breather. However, he seemed to imply we would need a rest from each other. I cried uncontrollably, struggling to breathe as I pondered why we needed a break. He insisted it wasn't a breakup, just a cooling-off period, claiming he was tired of the toxic dynamics in our relationship. I disagreed, believing our concerns could be addressed through conversation. When I fell ill, I took care of myself despite him returning home frequently. My mother asked him to stay with me since I was not feeling well, and he did. I organized everything, aware he was irritated but trying to manage nonetheless. On the third day, he checked on me, and when I mentioned feeling fine, I hesitated to agree fully, knowing he would soon leave. We exercised together, took many photos, and he ensured to bring my things home from the apartment as he knew I could be easily overwhelmed. When he returned home, we continued to chat despite his earlier request for space, as I found it unusual for him to request distance after nearly 4 years together. We would fight over trivial matters for days, but nothing had been this severe before. From January 15 to January 17, he ended the relationship, expressing he was truly done and fatigued. Initially, I struggled to believe him, assuming it was just a ploy to make me stop bothering him. I made it clear I wouldn't accept it unless he explicitly stated he no longer loved me, which he eventually did through a message. He became cold and distant, ignoring my attempts to connect. Even after the breakup, I pursued him, trying to keep communication alive. After a week, I withdrew into myself, drinking at our apartment. My brother came over and worried I might harm myself due to my depression. While he offered me a place to stay, I considered booking a hotel nearby. After some discussion with him, I decided to take a ride with him, but when I checked my wallet, I realized I had no cash and left my credit card at home. My phone was on the verge of dying, so I texted him to pick me up. After waiting for 5 hours with no response, I realized I had to walk back home. Upon arriving home, I charged my phone and noticed he had been messaging me, asking about my whereabouts and expressing desire to collect me. I informed him of my choice to walk home since he had not arrived, stating I felt foolish waiting outside. He questioned why I didn't plan ahead, suggesting I should not have gone out if I knew I had no money. His mother was also concerned. At that moment, I felt maybe I was unworthy of his love, having tolerated waiting for so long. I expressed that I would give him the space he needed. My mother wept, telling me he did not deserve my affection, and prayed for clarity. Our conversations dwindled to discussing financial matters related to the motorcycle registered under my name. Our anniversary arrived on January 24, and he asked if I wanted to spend my day off at his house for some care from his mother. I verified with her if he wanted me over, only to find out he had not informed his family about our breakup. Though I hoped for a reconciliation, my expectations diminished as the visit wore on. The night before I departed, I asked him again if he no longer loved me. When he wouldn't meet my gaze, I insisted he answer while looking at me, and finally, he spoke the words. When I prompted him about when he began to distance himself, he indicated the continuous arguments drained him. I probed further and suggested he might just be upset. He acknowledged the difficulty and confided I was causing him stress. The next morning, despite my persistent requests for his phone, he still refused. Frustrated, I pushed harder and shocked him by suggesting he toss my food aside. His reaction seemed uncharacteristic of him. I could sense a change. I decided to leave while he was out. Although his parents were hesitant to let me go home alone, they ultimately drove me as I had too much to carry. However, midway to my house, I experienced severe pain in my side. He stayed by my side, planning to take me to work, but the discomfort prevented me from going. Before leaving, he borrowed my helmet, left behind his jacket, and kissed me before departing. He suggested we would talk when I felt better. Breaking up seemed inevitable, as he claimed we couldn't recuperate together. He has since been enjoying life with friends, hanging out and drinking. He recently mentioned he was still sorting through his thoughts and needed time to respond to my queries. Even so, I feel he may not have the same affection anymore and could be seeing someone new. I decided to block him on Instagram and Facebook. Should I hold on to hope for reconciliation, or is it time for me to move on?